Welcome back. This is part 2 of my rebuild of the Dana 20 transfer case. We're going to start off by power washing all this grime off of it.
That's so boring.
We're going to start off by putting the new bearing on the rear output shaft. I used a press, but if you have a hammer and some patience, this works just fine. Next, we're going to do the front output shaft with the narrow end of the bearing facing away from the shaft. Next, we're going to press the new bearing races into the rear output housing, making sure to face the bearing's thick side in. Now, you don't want to damage any of the bearing surfaces on the races, so make sure to use a cap like this or anything that'll fit around the rim of the race. To make sure the bearing race was seated all the way down into the housing, I had to find a ring that would fit within the opening. Luckily, it was just small enough to get out. Now flip the rear output housing over and fit the other ring in. Once again, thick side towards the center of the housing. To make pressing these new races in a lot easier, make sure to keep the old race to use as a press tool. Make sure to press the new bearing races in all the way so they're not covering up this oil port. And with both bearing races in, this part is looking brand new. Don't worry about pressing any races into the main housing, as they all go in pretty easily and they'll only get in your way. With everything ready to go, I'm going to start off by putting in the new shift rod caps. Install the front wheel drive shift fork partway into the case and put the shift fork on the rod with the lock bolt towards the front. Put some blue Loctite on the lock bolt and install it in the fork and tighten down to 12 to 15 foot-pounds. Set the front output shaft sliding gear on the fork with the gear teeth facing the front of the transfer case. Next, hold the front output shaft gear in the case with the small teeth toward the sliding gear and install the front output shaft through this and the front sliding gear. If your case came with a thrush washer and a snap ring on the front output shaft, install the new one, or if not, install the spacer. Next, flip your case so the rear of the case is facing the table so you can put on the front output bearing. Place the new bearing cone on the output shaft with the narrow end of the bearing facing the outside of the case. Then, gently tap down the new bearing onto the shaft with a pipe or a stack of old bearings and a socket. With both bearings in, gently tap in both bearing races on each side of the case. Note, you won't be able to get both races in as they are designed to be held in with the covers. Here I'm putting some RTV on the front output gasket so I can put on the front output housing. I didn't put RTV on both sides of the gasket because I want to take the housing off later. Install the front output housing and torque the bolts down to 30 foot-pounds. Next, I'm going to flip the case on its side and carefully tap the rear bearing race forward to seat the front race against the front output housing. Grab the rear cover plate and make sure there's no shims stuck to it, and then hold the plate against the rear bearing race and measure the gap between the cover and the case with a feeler gauge. Add .010 to this reading to determine the trial shim pack thickness. Install the shim pack and rear cover, torquing the bolts to 30 foot-pounds. Once the rear plate is torqued down, place a block of wood against it and smack it with a hammer. This pushes the bearing race forward to seat up against the bearing. At this point I realize I have to put these tiny little balls down in here. They come with a little spring and they go right down in this hole. Well, it turns out that little spring that holds the ball in place is actually part of a much bigger spring that had broken off into little pieces. So, after ordering a new one and coming back in a few days, I was able to continue putting this together. I'm using a little bit of bearing grease to keep the springs and detent ball in place while I try and get this on. I'm sure there's an easier way to do it, but what worked for me is just find something to press the ball in as you slip it over the edge of the shift rod. In order to get the next rod in, you're going to have to pull up on the front wheel drive shift rod to allow the interlocking pins to slide over. When installing the shift rods, make sure that they're faced the right way so the detent ball goes in the short grooves and not the longer grooves that the pins go in. It really helps if the shift fork is actually inside the case when you bolt it to the rod. I should also note that you have to put the gears on the fork before putting the fork on the rod. With a little Loctite, torque the retaining bolt to 15 foot-pounds. Now that I'm done with the front output cover and the shift rods, I'm going to torque it down to 30 foot-pounds. Next is the intermediate gear. You can often upgrade these to a better and lower gear ratio, but that's an extra $600, so I'm saving that for next time. For now, I'm going to be reusing the old gear, but first I'm going to clean it up with some Scotch-Brite to get rid of any rough edges that could damage our new bearings. If you watched my last video on taking apart the Dana 20, you'll know that there are 48 roller bearings that go inside the idler gear. 24 on one side, a spacer in the middle, and then 24 on the other side with spacers on each end of the gear to hold it all together. Here, I'm using way too much bearing grease to hold the bearings and washers in place as I set everything up. Once the bearings are all set up, I'm going to slide the idler shaft through the bearings and rotate it around to make sure there's no binding or rough areas. Now comes the hard part. If you have assembly lube, this will really help. With the idler gear installed, there are two large washers with a tooth in it to hold them in place on each end of the gear. The hard part is getting the idler gear in place while with these washers still in the right position, as they tend to slide out. After messing with it for a while and trying different ways to keep everything in place, I found the easiest way is to take the idler shaft and partially install it into one side of the case so that there's just enough of a ridge to hold the washer in place. And then for the other washer, I'm using a large socket that's about the right size. These will hold the washers in place as I gently position the idler gear and tap it into place. With the idler gear lined up with the washers and the holes in the case, you're ready to slide in the idler shaft. But before you do that, make sure to rotate it so that the groove in the end of the shaft matches the bolt hole that locks it in place. To put together the rear output housing is just as simple as taking it apart. Start with the shaft, put on the speedometer gear and any shims that came with it, and then drop the housing over top of it. And then carefully place the new bearing narrow side in on the shaft and hammer it down. Press on the new seal. And the yoke with some RTV on the splines to prevent any leaks. And bolt the rear output housing to the case. For some reason, the gasket that I got was a little small, so I just used RTV to make one. Give the RTV a couple hours to harden and then torque it down to 30 foot-pounds and the inspection cover to 15 foot-pounds. It's a good idea to go through the gears while turning the yoke to make sure there's no binding or other problems. If you get to this point and you're wondering why 4-low doesn't work, it's because on this shaft here, there's a final gear. This one, which bolts onto the end of the transmission. And here it sits, happy in its new home. But unless your truck came with a Dana 20, installing it's not going to be that simple. In my next video, I'll show you a few things I had to do to get this thing to fit. Until then, thank you for watching my video, and if you're interested in my Camaro or Jeep projects, please like and subscribe as I got a ton more videos coming.